Welcome to this Tax Justice Network podcast looking at some of the findings of the 2020 Financial Secrecy Index and its relevance for the Middle East, Arab-speaking countries and the MENA region. I'm Naomi Fowler from the Tax Justice Network's monthly podcast, The Taxcast, and I'm speaking to the Tax Justice Network's CEO, Alex Cobham. How would you summarise this region?
Of all the regions, this is the most secretive, ahead of Latin America. And like most regions, the jurisdictions of concern come in two types. There's jurisdictions like Algeria, in this case, which has the highest secrecy score, a score of 80, but very little in the way of the global share of financial services exports. So there's a clear need for reform, but not actually a significant global threat as things stand. Then there are jurisdictions that have a bigger share of the global market in financial services exports and a level of secrecy that is high enough to pose a concern. And there we see the likes of Israel with a secrecy score of 59, the best in the region, and Lebanon close behind it, which has actually had the biggest reduction in secrecy score compared to the last index of all countries. And here you see they're not major global players, but they're big enough to pose a threat internationally, and they're not the most secretive, but secretive enough, again, to pose a risk. If we look across the region as a whole, it's the United Arab Emirates that's the biggest concern, and in many ways has led a race to the bottom from the cutting of standards in general, including around financial regulation, and the development of a free trade zone specialising in commodities, which raises all sorts of risks. Bahrain is another that's seen improvement, both in its secrecy score, and that stems mainly from signing up to international standards. So there is progress going on here, but it remains the most secretive region. Clearly a major agenda of work ahead. Some particular areas we could identify in terms of automatic exchange of information. Too many countries in the region still not signed up, not participating, or some like the UAE, but also Kuwait, Bahrain, Lebanon and Qatar, which are choosing not to receive any information even though they're providing information to others, which doesn't bode well for domestic measures against secrecy, against corruption, indeed in favour of progressive taxation. In terms of beneficial ownership, there's pretty much a weak performance across the region. Very few public registers, in fact no public registers of beneficial ownership, very few registers. Few registers even of legal ownership, and a number of jurisdictions offering trusts and foundations. In terms of the country-by-country reporting of multinational companies, as is generally the case still around the world, no jurisdiction requires multinationals to publish their country-by-country reporting, nor do they have robust rules on local filing. So a clear agenda for progress needed in this region.
The UAE, United Arab Emirates, is a particularly devious and dangerous player on the rise. Why is that?
The United Arab Emirates remains a jurisdiction of significant concern. It's ranked 10th in the Financial Secrecy Index 2020. It has a small share only of the global total of financial services exports, though it has increased its share this year. But the reason it's in the top 10 is because it's very high secrecy score. It's gone from a little over 80 to a little under 80, so it's making progress, but it remains very much at the top end of jurisdictions. Most of the other jurisdictions with a secrecy score that high are jurisdictions with almost no financial services exports at all that really don't pose a threat. So although the UAE is a small player, its secrecy makes it a significant risk. Now, it has made that bit of progress this year, reducing its secrecy score in a number of areas, but at the same time it's continued to act very aggressively, and indeed it's worsened its score in one area where it's created the possibility to establish foundations with minimal reporting requirements at all, so effectively a new anonymous ownership vehicle type for sale. Its aggressive positioning in the region and globally more widely means that it acts as an aggressive ambassador for the race to the bottom, pushing down regulations, making taxation harder and corruption more likely elsewhere. For that reason, it fully merits its place in the top 10 of the FSI 2020.
Why has Bahrain dropped so much? It's gone from 17th to 81st place.
Bahrain is one of the real success stories of the Financial Secrecy Index 2020. It's made an almost unbelievable improvement of 64 ranking places, shifting it into 81st position in the ranking. And it's done that through a combination of a reduction in its global scale weight, that's a reduction in the share of financial services exports globally that it provides, and a very sharp drop in its secrecy score. And that's been achieved largely in the areas of beneficial ownership registration and adherence to international standards in a number of areas. But the effect is to show that in what is the most secretive world region, that really quite dramatic progress is possible. And when you compare that to a jurisdiction like the United Arab Emirates, still ranked in the top 10 and still highly secretive, it shows the kind of difference that it's possible to make if a jurisdiction is committed, even if they're starting from a position of very high secrecy indeed. So, well done, Bahrain. Also in the region, we've seen relatively positive stories in terms of the secrecy score, particularly of Lebanon and Israel, now among the most transparent jurisdictions in the region, although again with the caveat that this is the most secretive world region. In Lebanon's case, we've seen a drop of around 8 points in the secrecy score and also a drop in its share of global financial services exports, resulting in an improvement in the ranking of 15 places. Now, Israel has seen a 4.5 point drop in its secrecy score, but in Israel's case, actually an increase in its share of global financial services exports, so the improvement in its ranking was only 4 places. Nonetheless, movements in the right direction, but these remain jurisdictions of some concern, albeit not as high as previously.
Algeria is the most secretive country in the index after the Maldives, but these are very small players. What would be the most urgent thing countries in this region should do now to improve the situation?
So Algeria is the most secretive jurisdiction in the region and indeed in the whole index after the Maldives. But both are very small players. Algeria, for example, has roughly 0.05% of the global total of financial services exports. That's financial services provided to non-residents. And yet its secrecy score of almost 80 puts it right at the top if we look purely at secrecy score, and brings it to an overall ranking of 23 in the Financial Secrecy Index 2020. Now, in this case, because it's such a small player globally, your expectation would be that the dangers here, or the risk factors, are really about a failure to bring standards, regulations in line with international norms, because not very much international business is being done, rather than because Algeria is necessarily positioning itself aggressively to compete for dirty business. Nonetheless, there is a clear policy priority for Algeria to raise its standards and recognise that it is now posing a global threat because of that level of secrecy. Across the region more generally, as I've said, there's also the somewhat more transparent jurisdictions like Israel and Lebanon that have a much larger share of the global total of financial services exports, and where the rankings are lower, but the policy priorities for reform are nonetheless important. And those are the two types of issues that the region faces across the piece. There is a very urgent need to address the potential for anonymous ownership of companies, trusts and foundations, and to engage much more consistently with international standards, including for the automatic exchange of financial account information, and to require public country-by-country reporting by multinational companies.
Thanks for listening. You can read more on the methodology and results, along with plenty of other data, on www.financialsecrecyindex.com.